All right, well, welcome, friends. I'm Brenda Moore. I'm a consultant, a coach, an independent contractor, and in those roles, I equip ministry leaders with philanthropy's best practices. I love what I do. And if there's nothing else you get from this evening, I hope you realize how lucky and blessed I feel to be able to do this really good work at the intersection of faith and philanthropy. And so I want to welcome you to this first session of Legacy Giving, the basics. Thanks so much for being here. And the very fact that you're here tells me that you care deeply about the future of the ministries and the people that you lead and serve. And I honor you for that. Again, just a few logistics before we get started. So if you're with me live, I think everybody's microphones are muted so that we can kind of manage for the sound quality of the recording. But you do have the ability to participate by typing in your questions and or going on to chat and raising your hand there. I actually do have the chat screen right in front of me now, and so I can see anything on chat that you might want to share. But before we go too much further, I actually want to start by asking you a few questions. And I'm wondering if you've wrestled with what I call the future questions lately. If you're with me live, it is the new year after all, and that's when we tend to wrestle with the future questions. And I wonder if when you think about the future of your church or your favorite ministries, do you wonder sometimes how they can thrive in this kind of constant whitewater that we live in, this ever-changing culture? And with some institutions and churches actually closing their doors, maybe you do even worry about your ministry's survival. I've worked with congregations who worry about their survival and with ministry organizations who worry about that. And then you can't help but wonder, well, what does this mean for my family? What does this mean for the family of God? Will these ministries I care so deeply about be here to walk alongside my great-grandchildren, the people in my community or my global neighbors? And then have you asked yourself the question, what can I do about it? I call these kinds of questions my legacy questions, and I've been asking myself a lot of legacy questions really since the time that my children came into my life, and somewhere between the adoption of my children and the death of my dad a couple of years ago. These legacy questions have been important questions to me. And when I use the word legacy, I don't want you to think about something you leave behind. I want you to think about something you'll pass forward, okay? That's my definition of legacy. So what can you do about it? Well, there are a lot of things that you can do to pass the legacy of faith on to the next generation. And congratulations, you're taking an important step forward right now just by being here and learning more about legacy giving. But I don't want to be a fearmonger either. We're people of faith. Let's stop for a minute and set aside these worries about the future of our ministries, and let's remind ourselves what God's already doing about it. God reminds us that He's not going to leave us hanging. He reminds us that we will always have more than enough to do what needs to be done. And one of the things that's crystal clear to me is that God has given us more than enough human potential for all kinds of good things. It's been more than 30 years now, I'll confess 35, that I've been blessed to work with some really incredible faith leaders, including some of you, and executive directors, pastors, presidents, board members, church council members, development committee members, fundraising volunteers. I've worked with them in their $100 million campaigns and in their $1,000 projects and everything in between. And I've seen them and you accomplish some really amazing things. But unfortunately, I've also seen these faith leaders face some of the same obstacles about money and ministry over and over again. And in fact, some of the same obstacles that I've faced in my early ministry. And the first obstacle I faced was simply a lack of confidence. I mean, God wanted me to ask people for money, and I fought God on this for a long time. until I realized it wasn't about me. I wasn't inviting gifts for me. I was inviting gifts for the benefit of others, and that's why it's called philanthropy. It's about the love of humankind. So inviting gifts for God's work isn't greedy, it's noble, it's God-honoring work. But it took me a while to get that and to pursue this work with confidence. And I also faced capacity obstacles. In fact, the small ministry organizations that I first served relied totally on charitable gift income, and some months they barely had the capacity to pay their staff. And I didn't fully appreciate either the real capacity for giving that some of my donors had, much less how to help them share it. And then I also lacked competence. That was a big obstacle. And it didn't take too long to learn the ropes of events and direct mail and phone-a-thons and other processes we use to encourage giving. But the more sophisticated stuff, major gifts and planned giving, I didn't even know what I didn't know. And thank goodness I got connected to a Christian Association of Development Professionals that helped me grow in my competence. I'm eternally grateful to the extraordinary colleagues and mentors and consultants who accompanied me as I developed my skills for engaging the capacity of my donors. And I don't even know where I'd be were it not for the people who had more confidence in me than I had in myself. So if you're, I share this all with you because I want you to know that if you're experiencing similar obstacles about money and ministry, just know that you are not alone, not by a long shot. I'm here for you. There are other people who are here to walk alongside you. I'd love to be your guide. And more than anything, I want you to recognize that God has given you more than enough competence, capacity, and confidence here at this intersection of faith and philanthropy. So let's get to work and start building our competence about legacy giving. And we'll start with an introduction to legacy giving and what it is and why it matters and how you can imagine getting started in this important work. And then I'll introduce you to my legacy giving framework and the 6 keys to establishing an effective program and a year-round process. And then next we'll get into the specific steps related to legacy giving leadership. That'll be one of our primary focuses for tonight. And then I'll close with some specific recommendations for your next steps. And all along the way, I'll also introduce you to some of the downloadable resources that will become an important part of your toolkit in carrying out this work. Now, I also want to say that I realize that some of you have already been doing this work in one way, shape, or form, and maybe for a while, and that's great. I hope you'll work through this presentation with an eye toward what's missing from your current program or what could be improved. I've worked with so many organizations whose gaps have become stumbling blocks. And so it's my hope that your engagement in the Legacy Giving Program in its entirety will provide you with some stepping stones to smooth your way forward. So let's simply start with the term legacy giving. What is it anyway? And I suspect that you might be familiar with the term planned giving. The nonprofit sector uses the term planned gift to describe gifts that are given from assets instead of cash. And planned gifts do require more effort and intentionality than the simplicity of writing a check or using a credit card. But I prefer this comparable term legacy gift simply because it infers more about what planned gifts accomplish. And it's through our legacy gifts that we play a role in passing on the legacy of faith to future generations. So why legacy giving now? What's the urgency? And I do feel an urgency about this. And maybe it's because I've been working with so many organizations for so many years who still struggle with it. But the timing is so right for this work. And it's why I'm jumping in with both feet and becoming more of an intentional teacher around this subject. I think there are 3 primary reasons why legacy giving has an urgency now that is so important. And I hope you would agree that the first one is that your ministry's never been more important and that your leadership's never been more critical. I think that God's people, both now and in the future, need your organization alongside them in their walk of faith. And this is an urgency that's so prevalent in my conversations with faith leaders. And despite our trust in God's plans and promises, we're anxious about how this post-Christian world is going to impact future generations and the ministries we care deeply about. So I think we feel that personal urgency as it relates to our ministries. But then the other reason that I think now is the time is because the opportunity for generosity to impact and transform our missions has never been greater. We know that the United States is in the midst of this great generational wealth transfer. Some of the numbers keep changing, but more or less we hear that an estimated 60 trillion will transfer from one generation to the next between now and 2050. And we hear that about 6 trillion of that will benefit nonprofits, and we know that about a third of that will benefit religious organizations. We also know that an average American holds only 10% of their wealth in cash. And I want you to look at my illustration. I want you to look at the small bucket, because the gifts that we're usually inviting from cash are the gifts and the wealth that come from the small bucket. 90% of an American's wealth on average is in accumulated assets. That's the stuff in the big bucket. As my husband said last night, Brenda, that one's my bucket. But you know, most ministries are only realizing gifts from the 10%. And they don't know where to start with the other 90%. The average nonprofit organization receives about 8% of its charitable gift income through bequests. Ministry organizations, unfortunately, typically receive far less. And people have asked me over and over again, why aren't we receiving more of these kinds of gifts? And I have to answer them with my own question. And that is, are you inviting them? And then the third thing I think that brings a sense of urgency is just this whole area of financial sustainability. And it's so true that legacy giving adds to the financial sustainability and stability of your ministry, both in the short term and in the long term. And even though it might take several years before you start receiving bequests, establishing a legacy giving program now, before your ministry finds itself facing any financial challenges, is the wise approach. And a mature legacy giving program also has the capacity to grow current revenues. We have some new research from Professor Russell James at Texas Tech University, who is the most recent guru in helping us understand planned giving. And his data confirms that bequest giving does not negatively impact current giving. In fact, quite the opposite. Those who decide to include a charitable beneficiary in their estate plans are likely to double their current giving to that organization during their lifetime. So financial stability, both present and future, is one of the reasons that I think legacy giving also has some urgency. And so, the other reason we want to move forward with a legacy giving program now is because people actually want to make these gifts. They want to make these types of gifts to your ministry for the same reasons that they want to support you during their lifetime. And the primary reasons they want to make these gifts are these. First of all, they're grateful. They're thankful to God for their generosity, for his generosity toward them. Secondly, they believe in your mission and they're inspired by your ministry and the life-saving, life-changing work that you do, and they want to be a partner with you in carrying that mission forward. Also, they've been personally impacted. They've experienced the value of your ministry firsthand. They can tell their own story about how your organization has made a difference in the life of them and their family. The other reason they'll make these gifts and want to make these gifts is because they trust you, and they trust your ministry's leaders, and they trust that the organization has a future, and they trust that the gift they share will be used wisely for the purpose intended. And then the other reason is that it brings them joy, and they've discovered how wonderful it feels to share some of what God has entrusted to them with others. Tell me that the most joyful people you know aren't generous people also. That's what I see. And then perhaps the most important reason that people will make these gifts is because you invite them to do it. I mentioned in the previous slide that an average of 8% of all charitable gifts come from bequests, but In reality, most of those gifts are going to the organizations that have been inviting them for a long time. Colleges and universities who have been inviting these kinds of gifts for many years receive on average 20% of their income from bequests. If you aren't inviting these gifts, somebody else is, but it's not too late to start. And then you'll notice that you don't see anything here about tax benefits as being a reason why people make these gifts. Tax implications and or benefits are rarely a reason why people choose to make a legacy gift. All of the research that's been conducted at various points in history suggests that tax benefits of planned gifts are the least important motivator for making a planned gift. So if there's an organizational urgency and an opportunity for receiving these gifts, and if donors do want to make them, then why aren't we inviting them? Why aren't we working harder to help them through the door? And I would say it has a lot to do with the fact that planned giving has been this unnecessarily intimidating form of fundraising. And for too long, ministry leaders and even seasoned development professionals have avoided planned giving because of the intimidating terms and the concepts and regulations and complexities. And those things scare off even the most confident and well-intentioned people. So let's just start by taking all of the intimidating terms off the table and breaking them down into just 3 simple ways of thinking about legacy gifts. And I like to look at these gifts this way. There are give later gifts, give now gifts, and give and receive gifts. And the most common type of legacy gift is the kind that is planned for now, but it won't actually be given until later, most often when the donor doesn't need it anymore, and that would be at the time of their death. And donors like these give later kinds of gifts because they get to retain control of the asset and use of the asset throughout their lifetime. And these are often the gifts that we leave through our wills. We call those bequests. And more often these gifts are starting to be gifts that get named or transferred by beneficiary designation. And it's something as simple as using a beneficiary designation form that you can download online. So these gifts are easy to understand, they're easy to explain, they're easy to invite. And since 80% or more of these legacy gifts are these give later types, these are the gifts that this basics course will focus on. The next 2 types of gifts I'm going to address more later in a mastery course, and because they're less common and a little more complicated, although not terribly, we'll address them later. And one of them, the give now gift, is functionally what we hear about when we hear about endowments and donor advised funds. And those are gifts that people make now. And they can be established now, and those funds can make gifts to ministry now and beyond the life of the donor. And in fact, many people actually establish these funds with gifts they give now, and they will add to these funds with the give later gifts at the time of their death. And then finally, and perhaps least common, but very interesting, is the gift that's given during life or at death that also provides an income. And that income could go to the donor or it could go to others. And so if you hear people talking about gift annuities or charitable trusts, those are the give and receive type of gifts. And some of these gifts don't require significant planning, but others do. So again, we're going to introduce those more fully once you're ready to move on to the mastery course. So now I recognize that some of you here with me already have some type of bequest or simple plan giving program in place, but others of you do not. So let's start by asking the "Are you ready to start?" question. And how do you know if you're ready to start? Well, fortunately, the prerequisites for startup are very minimal. Virtually any nonprofit with history and leadership and a base of support can pursue legacy giving. And even if your organization isn't large and has limited time and resources, it's possible to raise money for ministry through bequests. And so I've got a little checklist here that you can look through that I've developed for you to help you assess whether or not you're ready. The ability to receive gifts because you're a 501c3, you have to be a charitable organization, obviously. I say at least 10 years of history because now you've got some staying power. Clear mission and purpose is so important because it drives your ministries and your programs, your services, and actually your funding priorities as well. Loyal contributors, a solid base of loyal contributors, those are the people, the loyal people who will make bequests and other legacy gifts. And then communicating with your contributors on your regular basis. So you already have channels in place for promoting your program. Leaders who are well respected, that's essential. Enough stability so that your donors will be confident about your future. An executive staff leader who will advocate for legacy giving. It's really important that that chief leader is leading and on board. And I'd like to say at least one governing board member who will also advocate for legacy giving. And so if this is all it takes to be ready to start, again, I ask, how come so many ministry organizations aren't ready to start? And well, maybe it's because they don't fully appreciate how much money is on the table with these types of gifts. And so I like to try to help my students and my clients understand at some level what a legacy giving program can produce. So there are a couple of different formulas that people use for calculating some of the estimated gift income potential, and I like my students and clients to see more of a range of that potential. So I use a couple of formulas, and the formulas that I got on the screen here are first based on and I've got an example here. You can plug in your own numbers, but I'm using the example of 1,000 contributors. Typically about 8% of Americans make bequests, and so you can figure about 80 out of 1,000 will make that decision. And then there's another formula that says about a third of the population will actually consider a legacy gift. And then you can more cautiously and conservatively imagine that about 1 out of 3 people who you would invite to consider would actually say yes. So in that case, now you've got 111 out of 1,000. And then there's some things that we know about average gift size. In order to do this calculation, if you know what your average bequest size is, that's the best figure to use. But I think a lot of organizations have so little bequest history that they don't know what their average bequest is. And so the most recent numbers that came out said that the average bequest for estates under $1 million last year was $57,000 per gift. And so that number has gone up quite a bit. I think we used to more conservatively use 25,000 as an average. That was something that we saw pretty commonly through the church body that I'm affiliated with. And so you can see here, in this particular case, 1,000 contributors estimating $2 million to $6.3 million worth of potential. And that's a pretty wide range, obviously, but I think it helps you appreciate the kind of potential that there is in raising these kinds of gifts. Granted, it's not all potential that comes in the door today. It's potential for the future. And so if you're interested in being able to calculate some of your own numbers, there's a couple of worksheets that I attach with all of the different resources here. And one helps you take a look at your own bequest history. And the other is actually the chart that I just shared with you. It's the worksheet that helps you with these specific calculations. So, so the other thing that, that is a reality is that there is some cost. And so one of the reasons that people might not invest and participate is because they realize it's going to cost them something to do that. But, and they also are afraid that they need somebody full-time or they need a lot of time. And that does get to be expensive. It's really only the organizations that have full-time fundraising staff that seem to have the luxury of having a full-time plan giving professional. And when you're talking about a full-time professional in this work, by the time that you have salary, benefits, travel expenses, marketing and promotion, continuing ed, some fairly sophisticated software programs, now we're talking about an average budget for a plan giving position of about $150,000. So you can appreciate why small ministry organizations don't have a single person doing this work. But one of the other things that I've seen more and more of, and I'm a participant in this way of helping as well, is through more of a progressive investment. And so, you can get started, obviously, in learning more about this for a very modest cost just by participating in some webinars. And I've got several clients that I'm working with who I provide a more limited amount of consulting time with, and between online and on-site consultation, we can do that over the course of a year for less than $5,000 as well. And then there are other clients who want to be able to contract several days a month to have somebody actually do gift planning work, and that's a more common scenario as well. So the independent contractor for smaller organizations is kind of the way to go, and it's much more accessible in terms of cost to get started. And so that gives you a little bit of a taste of what a program could cost. Then the question comes right after that, well, how do we fund it? Because most organizations I know don't have extra money in their general operating budgets in order to fund this work. But clearly, this is a really important investment. I want you to appreciate that you're investing a small amount of money for a really very sizable return over the long haul. And so you have to think about investing in legacy giving like an investment with that kind of a return. So typically organizations are going to fund this work by doing one of three things. They typically don't put it in their general operating budget. You could. But typically what they'll do to get started, and we did this even at the college level when we were trying to fund new positions or additional people to be in the field, we would use the most recent bequest and designate a certain portion of the most recent bequest in order to invest in this work. Another way of doing it for people who do have endowments, who they're trying to grow those endowments, is to direct some of the endowment distributions toward this work. And then finally, some organizations also have some reserves, and those reserves are invested probably pretty conservatively, again, over the long haul. And so there's a way of thinking about investing a portion of a reserve fund in order to get a program like this going. So again, I'll beg the question, if the prerequisites for getting started are so modest, and if the potential gift revenues are so significant, and if the costs for launching a program really aren't that exorbitant, then how come more ministry organizations aren't taking action? And I think it does go back to competence, confidence, and capacity. And like me in early career, many faith leaders tell me we don't even know what we don't know. So knowing where to start, how to organize, what to focus on for the best results, that's a source of a lot of frustration. And I also assume it's been the source of a lot of wasted time for organizations who've tried to approach this maybe in fits and starts. And so it's because of your struggle, a struggle that was also mine, that I've created this legacy giving curriculum. And after years of using planned giving's best practices, I've synthesized and simplified what I've learned so that I can shorten your learning curve, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I've collected and refined my resources and my tools, again, so that you've got something that's ready to use, that you don't have to make up from scratch. And so in my legacy giving program, I actually use the word legacy as an acronym to create this framework for what I call the 6 keys to legacy giving. And in fact, if you visit my website at brendamore.org, you can download my free booklet. It's called The 6 Keys to Legacy Giving, and it maps this out in a bit more detail. But in a nutshell, there's 6 basic components to legacy giving, and it's those 6 components that hold it all together and make it all work. And I'll be addressing each one of those keys in detail in each of the 6 webinars that are part of this series. And so the first key is leadership, and we're going to spend the rest of the session this evening looking at that. The second key is education, and in that session I'll be introducing the educational steps that are involved in both equipping your leadership team, your legacy giving leadership, and your potential donors. The third key is gifts, and inevitably this is where organizations stall. I've worked with so many churches in particular who establish endowment funds, but their impact, their distributions, they're marginal at best because they're not actively inviting gifts to the fund. So we'll focus on the most effective ways to help you get some future gifts in your pipeline. And then the fourth key, administration, will cover some of the key policies and processes, some of the laws and regulations that govern this work. It's important that those are in place and that you are appropriately stewarding your program. The fifth key, communication, that will help you develop a year-round plan for promoting your legacy giving program and weaving it into all of your pre-existing channels for communication. And then the sixth session, We're really going to zero in on you. The why in legacy giving is you, because legacy giving can't happen without everything you bring to this ministry and to this work. So that's the framework for legacy giving. I can't wait to unpack it in its entirety over the course of the 6 sessions that are included in this basics curriculum. And so we're going to charge into leadership. It's the first key for establishing your program. If you've been a student of leadership literature, you surely have read John Maxwell. He's probably the most prolific author in the field. And I like John because his faith shows up in so much of his teaching. And this is a favorite quote about leadership. I think it paints such a simple picture of what leadership is. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And I just want to underscore the fact that I've developed this program for you and for other ministry leaders who are ready to go the way and willing to show the way, but you simply don't know the ways of legacy giving. And so I want you to understand that establishing an effective leadership model lays the foundation. It's so important to get off to the right start with the right people, focused on the right destination. It's fundamental to creating your initial momentum. And there are really the 2 outcomes that you should achieve in this stage of the legacy giving process. 2 results you should expect. One is that you would come out of this leadership phase with a program that has been presented to and approved by your governing board. That could be your board of directors if you're a nonprofit organization, or it's the equivalent of a church council or a board of deacons if you're a congregation. And then you should also expect that you would come out of this stage with a leadership work group that shares a common vision and purpose. And this is not your governing board. It's a separate group that can really focus on this task. So there are just these 2 major steps. Each one has 3 parts, and we're going to take a look at each of those 3 parts. So the first move toward your governance approval involves the identification of the people who will be the champions for moving this forward. And I am hoping that the people who are actually participating in this webinar are going to be champions. I'm rather expecting that and hoping and praying that you will move forward from here and say, I've got what I need to do this. And ideally, there are 2 of you working together to advocate for your program's initiation. I think it's really important that there are 2, even in programs that have been around, that there are 2 that are leading and can sustain a program. And, you know, there's something biblical and very practical about 2 being better than 1. So 2 champions. I would suggest that one of the 2 is a chief executive or a lead pastor, perhaps, if you're in a congregation. And this is the leader that's hired by your governing board to fulfill the organization's mission and direct the day-to-day operations. He or she is the public face of your ministry, and it's that face that's going to imbue the trust among those of you or those who might potentially become your legacy givers. So a chief executive, lead pastor. And then the second champion is most likely a trusted current or former board member of your board, or former member of your board, excuse me, someone who's got long-term stake in the ministry. And that long-term stake might very well surpass that of the chief executive, because CEOs, executive directors, pastors come and go, and sometimes it's the longtime member in the trenches who really has the most skin in the game. Sometimes this is the former board chairperson, could have been a campaign chairperson, maybe it's a stewardship committee chairperson, but it's someone whose dedication to your mission will inspire the unapologetic encouragement of legacy giving, and someone who would be most likely to make a legacy gift themselves. So the initial impetus for pursuing a legacy giving program might come from one or the other, or it might even come from somebody else in the organization entirely. But I would say if you have a development staff person, it's often that voice that says, we need to have this planned giving program in place. But working together, these 2 champions then provide the essential influence over the decision to move forward. It really needs to be these 2 who lead into the next step And this is where these two champions make their commitment to one another, and now it's time to ask for the governing board's endorsement. And ideally, you're able to carve out a place on the agenda of one of your board's regularly scheduled meetings, also one that's well attended, because you want people to have great ownership from the very beginning for this. You'll probably want to allow up to 45 minutes of the agenda time for your presentation and discussion. These two champions work together to develop and bring this presentation to the group. And here's what I suggest that presentation look like. I actually have a point-by-point agenda that I recommend that moves through all of the introduction and ownership steps that I think are essential. And I'm not going to walk through that with you here. I think you can read it. Again, this will be one of those downloadable resources, but it tees up every piece of information that your governing board would need to have and to know in order to make a responsible decision about moving this kind of a program forward. So this is a resource that you can use and adapt. And then the next piece of that process is to actually put a resolution in front of them. It's critical that they properly own and have proper oversight for this program as well. So your board needs to take some official action on a formal resolution. And if they're not ready to do that after you present this to them the first time, if they need more information, don't rush a decision. Defer it, only one meeting, and provide the additional information they need, but you do want to ask them to act. And again, here's a resolution that's a pretty common one that you can adapt for your own purposes. And I would encourage you to remember to include this resolution or the adopted resolution in the formal minutes of your meeting. It's really important that you can trace some of this information back. And then it's important for the group to have a name, an identity. And so in the next step now, as we start establishing your work group, that's step number 2. Sometimes it might be reestablishing a group that has atrophied a bit, but it's important that they have a name they can live with for a long time. And your organization might already have a committee designated for this work. Maybe you already have an endowment committee. It may already have some protocols for the names it gives to different types of work groups. Maybe you have teams and not committees. Maybe it's a team of staff people and volunteers who are collected into some sort of a team or a work group. But I would say keep the name simple, keep it straightforward. Don't pretend to be something you're not. You're not a board unless you have governance authority. You're not a foundation unless your fund is legally a separate entity. So give yourself a name that is easy for people to understand, easy for you to live with, and gives you an identity that will connect people to your legacy giving program. And then the next step is collecting the leaders. It's identifying the work group leaders. And I call it a work group because too many organizations get advisors around the table and they only provide advice. You need a work group. And it can be staff and volunteers. The people who you want to consider for this work need to have really 3 primary characteristics. 1, they need to be committed to the mission and ministry of your organization. Absolutely, that's a given. 2, they need to be held in high regard and widely trusted by your stakeholders. And then 3, they need to be able to mitigate any possible conflicts of interest. And the reason that I put that one out there for you is because ideally this group does include several practicing professionals because they have got the knowledge, they've got access, they've got connections. In the best case scenario, if I were to put together my dream team for a legacy giving work group, here's who I'd have on it. I'd have an estate planning attorney. I'd have a financial planner or a wealth manager. I'd have a resource development professional. I'd probably have a tax accountant. I would certainly have a communications or a marketing expert. And I would also want to have people who really know the potential legacy givers well. I think it's really useful to have a core group of, a minimum of 5, but ideally 7 people who really are willing to take ownership for different pieces of the whole legacy giving program and work it. Your 2 legacy giving champions are likely able to identify these people, but you may want to engage some staff and board members in identifying these people as well. And then to me, it's just really important that you actually enlist these individuals face to face It gives you a chance to look them in the eye and tell them why you believe they're such an important partner in launching this new program. And then this role description, again, a resource for you, will help you interpret to them what their engagement would look like and what their responsibilities would be. And I would say, if you find someone that's hesitant, don't let them say no right away. If you can help it, encourage them to come to your first meeting and to learn more about what is going to be happening before they make their decision. And then I also would say, within short order then of enlisting your work group, it's time for your first meeting. You'll want to introduce much of the same information that was presented to your board, and you'll want to introduce the process and the timeline for moving forward. And you'll also want to establish a common vision and purpose. And this common vision and purpose shapes your case for support. You'll use it to inform and inspire all of your potential legacy givers. You'll also use it to name some of your funding priorities. And so what I have for you is, again, a worksheet, a simple worksheet to kind of guide you through the process of establishing a purpose statement and a vision statement and your fundraising priorities. Just a few comments on this. No need to overcomplexify this step, because if in fact the organization and the ministry you serve already has a purpose statement, then chances are your legacy work group exists to raise money to serve that purpose. And the same is true with your vision. You can articulate a vision of what you want to accomplish and tie it directly to your organization's strategic plan. That's where the vision of the organization gets articulated, and this group really should exist to serve that. And then finally, defining your funding priorities. You know, your vision and mission statements should point directly to your funding priorities, and those priorities, I always suggest, would be narrow enough to ensure that your vision can be fulfilled, but they also need to be defined broadly enough, because your mission and purpose and vision can change. And so narrow enough, broad enough, and it needs to serve your ministry's mission and vision. And I tell you what, it shouldn't be a priority, and you shouldn't be inviting gifts for it if it's not a part of your organization's mission and purpose. There are other organizations that can do that. So we are getting close to the end, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I also want to leave you with this last slide, one of the last slides, because I hope you will dive in starting tomorrow. I want to challenge you to dive in. I don't want you to wait. And I want to tell you just a little bit about Christina's dive here, her start into the pool this particular morning. And in fact, her starts look really pretty good compared to the way that they used to. But this was one of those mornings where they had to be in the pool at 6 o'clock, and the pool was an hour away, and it was a 50-degree morning. And I know what was going through her head when she took that start into that pool and took that dive into that pool. And she didn't want to do it, but she knew that was the way to start the day, that was the first thing she was going to have to do, is just dive into that pool. I want you to have that same sense of moving forward. Don't wait for things to be perfect. Don't wait for things to be warm. Don't wait for all of the ducks to be in a row. You just need to do it. If you wait for perfection, you'll never move forward. And so just dive in. And this is what I would like to encourage you to do today, tomorrow at the latest. Identify who your co-champion will be in this process. And I'm making a big assumption here that you will be the other champion. And then share this video with them. This video is going to be available for you, I would assume, first thing tomorrow. Next week, sit down with that co-champion and work through the resources, chart your course. And then next month, get on the agenda for your board, for your governing body, right away next month. And then next month, join the webinar. Join the next webinar where we're going to talk about education. That's my challenge to you. I hope and pray you feel the urgency, and I hope and pray that you feel more competent, confident, and feel the capacity already So more power to you. I wish you all kinds of blessings in moving this effort forward. I know God will bless it. So with that, I will simply put this slide up. Thank you so much. What questions do you have? And I'll be watching. In fact, I'll watch both the Q&A and the chat here to see if I can answer some of your questions. And if you don't have any questions, feel free to say goodbye. But if you have questions and want to stay, I'll be fielding them and answering them here.